science fiction and fiction in general, I think. And we have some great panelists for you. I do want to say right off the bat that unfortunately Blake Crouch's flight was delayed due to weather, so he is actually not going to make it today at all. But he will, or at least the hope is he will be here tomorrow, and I think he does have a panel at noon tomorrow, 12:15, Geek Revolution. So if you were hoping to meet Blake, hopefully you can stay and hear from these great people, but you should get a chance to meet him tomorrow still. And there will be galleys of his book at the autograph signing after this, even though he's not here.
A courageous princess bound.
Sure.
I thought we were getting themed.
Did I?
For a second there.
Yeah.
I didn't touch
Really
it.
It's like hyper.
I promise. All right. So let me quickly introduce panelists. I have a few questions to start them off, and then hopefully you guys will come with some great questions as well, and we'll just talk about all kinds of fun stuff. So first up is award-winning author and visual effects artist Peter Tieryas. Peter's the author of the acclaimed novel The United States of Japan, and most recently the sequel Mecha Samurai Empire. And when he's not busy helping Hollywood animation studios bring their films to life, he's writing these amazing novels. Welcome, Peter. Next up, we have the New York Times best-selling author Madeleine Roux. This May, Madeleine will release Tomb of Ancients, the latest entry in her YA series House of Furies. She's also the author of the Asylum series and Alison Carter is Trapped, a zombie series based on her viral blog of the same name. Mm-hmm. All right. And last but not least is Rob Hart. Rob's the author of a whole slew of novels, including Takeout, New York, the Ash McKenna series, and coming this summer, The Warehouse. He's published a short story collection about culinary crime, is that right? Yep. I want to read that immediately. And he co-wrote a book with James Patterson. I haven't met Rob, but he's already the proverbial hardest working person in showbiz with all this. And then, of course, Blake Crouch was not able to make it, so we're all sad about that. But moving right along.
Hey, Jason, can you tell us about yourselves?
Oh, gosh, I'm sorry.
You.
I'm just the moderator. So, my name is Jason Huff. I'm a science fiction author, and this is about them.
A really good one. So.
What's that?
A really good one.
Oh, geez. Okay. All right. Well, I just want to get into the topic right away. So, quick story time. Back when I was an impressionable teenager, I went and played paintball for the first time and only time. And when the first battle started, I poked my head up out of this trench to kind of see where the enemy was, and immediately was shot in the face with paintball. I was wearing protective goggles, don't worry. But the point, I guess, is that it was over in an instant. That same summer, I snuck in to see the movie Aliens 11 times in 11 subsequent weekends. And I feel like those are like the sort of pillars of my action scene, like well of inspiration. There's plenty of other stuff. But those two things I kind of always come back to as like polar opposites almost of great action scenes that are well paced and all this beautiful stuff, and then this paintball experience where it was just like I didn't even get to do anything. So I'm curious for each of you, do you have sort of like those defining moments in your life that was kind of is the root of your action scene sort of inspiration, or in general, what do you draw on for inspiration for writing action sequences?
Gosh, who's starting?
Whoever wants to.
Pop quiz. Okay. I'm trying to think. For me, my sci-fi debut is coming out in October. It's called Salvaged, and it's sort of my take on Beauty and the Beast in space, but this time the beast and the curse in general is a parasitic alien. And so for me, the whole inspiration of it was this idea, like, I realize we're all sci-fi geeks here, but the thought of being in space is absolutely terrifying to me. Like, you could not pay me money to go into space, because if something goes wrong, it's over. Like, there's no coming back if something goes wrong in a spaceship. So to me, the thought of being stuck, you're the one person who's not infested by this parasite, and you're in a ship with these people that you're getting to know and care about, and they have this parasite, and you're like, oh, I want to save you, but oh, you're dangerous. To me, it's like, I love a premise like with that much tension. And it's similar to Alien, where it's like, you're just, Ripley, you're just like, you're rooting for her the whole time. You just don't want her to go. And for me, I felt like it's a similar feeling in that book, where there's this like one female hero and she's kind of holding it all together. And so for me, it was this tension of like, you know, this creeping dread of the parasite growing stronger, and also that there's nowhere to go. You're in space. You're done. You either solve this problem or you die. So to me, it's like, I love a book that just has a setup where there's tension no matter what. Like at every moment, even in a slow sort of moment, there's still going to be some dread and some tension. You're never going to let that go completely.
Yeah. For me, in Mecha Samurai Empire and my series, when I was growing up, I spent a couple of years in Asia. And during that time, I started finding out a lot about the past of World War II and what had happened back then. And it was stuff that I had never even heard about, because I actually grew up in America, went to Korea for a few years, and a lot of the family members I had, they could actually speak fluent Japanese, and they were really familiar with the Japanese language. So I kind of was confused, and I began to find out this was more about what happened during the occupation of World War II. And what was fascinating for me was there's so much known about the European side of World War II, but almost nothing about Asia, right? Who were like the generals in China, in Japan, in Korea, right? And you see the after effects of that even now with like the debates between North Korea and what's going on over there. So for me, I began with that as a sort of historical route where it was almost like a mystery for me to try to figure out what was going on. And for me also, even though I'm Asian, like when I actually moved to Asia, I felt like a foreigner there, right? So I was totally like, I couldn't speak the language. I was, you know, the English American kid. And so for me, the sort of connection that I found was video games. And so for me, video games were a huge inspiration. I loved video games as a kid. Like, you know, I still remember playing Bionic Commando and Zelda 2 and just Mario and everything. And so because of those roots back then, when I grew up, I actually wanted to work in video games. And so when I started writing about mechas, which I love, and just like, you know, these science fiction futuristic like super robots, I kind of drew on my background in video games. So when you see a video game, most times you might see a director or maybe a writer, right? But actually there's huge teams behind it, like hundreds of people, right? Going into the texture art, you know, the modeling and stuff. So when I started talking about how do mechas move, like how do they actually work, I wanted to be less about one single hero, which is what you normally see, but these huge crews, almost based like on tank crews, but also based on my video game experience. So, you know, like you were talking about Ripley and Tension, you have to care about the characters. So that to me, I think was the route where I sort of had the historical background, but also just the more personal background, drawing on my, you know, experiences. So,
from a personal standpoint, the thing I tend to draw on the most is I do fight training, so Krav Maga and a little bit of Muay Thai, and that has been a really informative experience as a writer. I had this writing professor once who said that when two characters touch, you really need to slow down and explore that, because when two people touch, it means something. And I also believe when two characters fight, you need to slow down and focus on that too, because you learn a lot about people from how they react to stressful situations, how they, you know, whether they push through it or they don't. There's so much that you can kind of build into that. And there's so much that you kind of don't really think about, like how jacked you get on adrenaline and how your fine motor skills go out the window and how, you know, your hand has all these little bones that want to break. And it's a lot of fun. And it's, in the warehouse in particular, I have a character who I was able to tap into some of the more specific fight training I'm doing. She's a corporate spy. And I got to write a fight scene with her at the end that I just am in absolute love with.
That's awesome. And that kind of leads a little bit into my next question, I guess, which is about what your sort of thought process or technique is when you're going into start an action scene that you're writing, in terms of figuring out the scope of it or the longevity, I guess, of the scene. To kind of go back to my example at the beginning about the paintball thing being over in an instant versus some really long drawn-out fight like something you'd see in, say, Daredevil or whatever. How do you decide what's the right one for the thing you're writing? What are the things that you're thinking about as you go into tackling an action scene?
Well, I actually think it dovetails nicely with what Rob was saying in that an action sequence isn't just about the action, it's really more about the character and what are you trying to accomplish, what are they trying to accomplish, and what are their actual skills and knowledge that they can rely on, because, you know, my character, she's more of a scientist, she's not a fighter, she doesn't have any training, so she has to use more, she's to outthink, basically, her enemies. She can't just rely on, like, brute strength or something, whereas some of the people who are fighting against her can rely on brute strength, so they're going to use that, and she's going to have to kind of outsmart them. So for me, it's just like tapping into, okay, what's the essential nature of this character, and then also realizing, like, it can't just be fight scenes all the time. There has to be pacing. You have to be anticipating that next sort of action sequence. So for me, I really love to just either read it aloud or have a friend take a look and say, like, okay, are there too many action sequences? We need time to slow down so that you get a breath and then you can ramp up into the next one. But I know for me, it's like, it's always back to character. It's never just about like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if? I mean, like, that's fun to think about, but I think the times in a movie or a book where I fall asleep is when I can tell it's the writer going, oh my God, wouldn't it be so cool if right now, if like he jumped off the building and then he grabbed it with one hand, and you're like, okay, but why? You know, like, there has to be a reason. And I think if you can meld that, like, wouldn't it be cool with like, okay, this actually has motivation and character development, I think that's the sweet spot of like a great action sequence, not just like the boom booms, but the motivated boom booms, I think, is how I would put it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, basically, an action scene without characters is like action porn, right? And I enjoy the Transformers series, but you know, sometimes I'm watching the movies and I'm like, wow, it's so much, right? I'm overwhelmed.
Mistakes.
Yeah.
Because no one ever gets hurt.
Yeah, yeah. And even when you see them get hurt, it's like just every part's flying off,
Yeah.
right, and stuff. I totally agree with both, like, in terms of just the characters, and like when I was talking about like doing mecha combat, I wanted to extend that just to even the weapons that they use. So one of the characters, her background when she was in high school, she was like a wrestler. So when she fights with her mecha, it's more like close quarter combat where she gets in really close and personal. Whereas there's another character who's a little bit older, he's more senior, and so it's kind of a throwback to anime. He uses like a magnetic yo-yo and just goes bam, bam, you know, really fast. So again, like the weapons, the way they fight reflects who they are. And again, it comes out a lot because they're fighting, like basically in this, it's an alternate history where like the United States of Japan fights the Nazis, right? So the Nazis are the way the Nazis fight, their version of mechas, like the huge robots, are almost like biologically genetic mutations that are just massive, right? And again, it's not so much about how strong they are, but it's more what they represent and how they kind of symbolize the sort of twisted and messed up history. For when I was writing this, like just talking about action scenes, I think there's sometimes when I'm getting into action scenes, there's like one scene that just pops up in my mind, and I'm like, I gotta write this. And for me, the image that came was one day I was just driving down the Bay Bridge, and I'm always stuck because the traffic is so bad. And then I thought, what if like a mecha suddenly attacked the bridge? And I'm on this bridge, right? What would I do, right? And that sort of became like the second half of this book, where there's like, Berkeley is basically under attack by the Nazis, and the huge mechas fight them. So again, that was just one where I was just in traffic, and I'm like, gosh, are we ever gonna get, move? And then finally, like, I just started seeing mechas, and all of a sudden, it was like my mind was like flowing, and I was like talking to myself, and my wife was like, what are you doing right now? And I'm like, I'm writing this action scene in my head, so.
I think to the pacing thing, I think that's a really good point, because I had a friend who once said that I thought was brilliant. The thing that kung fu movies and musicals have in common is that when the emotion hits ahead, when it gets to be too much, everyone either starts singing or starts fighting. So that's kind of the way you draw it out, is you look for those moments where it's like, okay, now this is going to fit in. And actually, in terms of like talking it out, I have actually acted out fight sequences, like kind of like done them like in my office, and then
I was going to ask about blocking.
Yeah, I love making big diagrams. Like, I love drawing it and be like, oh, they have to go. Oh no, how do they get over here?
Yeah, I realize how embarrassing that must look. Like, if someone saw me in my office just like sparring in my sweatpants, like as I'm writing something, which really underscores the bizarreness of this profession.
I have a quick follow-up, and this is mostly for you, Madeleine, I think, but I don't know your back catalog in terms of books as well as hers. But does any of that change depending on genre or writing for adult versus YA? Or how do you approach it any differently, I guess?
I mean, I can swear a lot more in this one, which is great. I was really excited about that. I mean, I started in adult, and then I kind of transitioned to YA, and now I do both. But yeah, I mean, it is different. You have, I forgot when I wrote the first draft and turned it in, it was very YA still because I was in that mode. And one of the differences is that, like, the way that adults process emotion is very different. And I feel like for everybody, I feel like shame is always the biggest motivator in any given situation, but like adults process it differently, and they'll lie a lot more, and they'll cover things up a lot more, and there's just more subtext and more layers to everything. And so I had to do a lot of drafts of this to sort of tease it out more, and you have more space. It can be longer, it can be more complex, and I really wanted to, all the crew aboard that are infected, I wanted you to really know all of them so that when they inevitably meet their demise, it really means something. Even if they became monstrous in the end, you knew them and you take part in that downfall. And so for me, it's, I don't think I pour as much into the making the villains as sympathetic in YA. I feel like I try to keep that a little more black and white in terms of stakes. But in this one, I really wanted to delve into every single person's backstory and have them feel really well-rounded, so the stakes are even higher, because even though you may not like them in that moment, you know it's because they're being taken over by this thing they can't really control. So yeah, I mean, it is different, and I think, you know, the violence level is very different. This one's pretty gory. There's a lot of body horror. Whereas in YA, you have to be pretty euphemistic with stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, it is different. It was a fun challenge to sort of, it was such a huge departure from writing basically gothic horror for teenagers to writing, you know, complex sci-fi romance for adults. It was very different.
I actually, I think I've tamped back on the violence a little bit, because The Warehouse, you know, it's a sci-fi book, kind of speculative-y, but primarily I was a crime fiction writer before this. So my previous novels were about an amateur private detective, and there were tons of fight scenes, to the point where, like, my uncle called me out once. He's like, "How is this guy still alive?" And which I actually, and it was a fun challenge to write a book with that I hope that I was building in a lot of tension and a lot of, like, weird character dynamics without having them, like, beat the crap out of each other all the time.
With my books, like, each of them is a standalone, so they're not actually connected other than being in the same universe. So, like, the first one, United States of Japan, it's more like a dystopian, totalitarian exploration of that dystopia, whereas Mecha Samurai Empire is more about, like, you know, the mecha. So the approach to action is totally different, whereas one is more cerebral, more like 1984 style. This is more like, if you're thinking Neon Genesis Evangelion and, you know, Pacific Rim. So again, like, just the approach was totally different, and the feel is different. So, and I think part of that also was just changing the perspective, because the first one is third person, whereas this is first person. So again, just getting into all that. So
Rob, I think you mentioned that there's small bones in the hand that want to break. And Peter, you mentioned, like, video games as an inspiration, and which makes me think of video game physics and, you know, people getting shot hundreds of times and then just you grab a health pack and you're good. So I wonder if it's a conscious choice going into writing a book, the level of realism you're going for, or if that just comes out naturally, or maybe you can talk about how you approach that and what level you try to go for.
I mean, you kind of want to hit a sweet spot, because you want it to be entertaining, you want it to be fun, but, you know, you also want it to be realistic enough that the reader could believe it. You know, it doesn't have to be 100% realistic, but it has to be enough that it seems reasonable. And the more training I do, the more I learn, the more I kind of want to pay respect to that. Like, one of the things that I love, and this is a fact that I've heard from a couple of people now, the minimum safe distance to hold someone at gunpoint is 21 feet. Because under 21 feet, you know, your fine motor skills go out the window when you're jacked up on adrenaline. Like, you could feasibly defend yourself under 20 feet. Whereas, you know, against a knife, like, they tell us all the time, like, if you're fighting someone with a knife, you're going to get cut. The point is to just not get cut enough that you die. And so, you know, that kind of thing really puts this realism into perspective of, you know, you watch, like, John Wick, and it looks super cool, but, like, these guys are fighting for, like, hours and shooting each other like crazy, and they're enjoyable movies, but I feel like, you know, and we talked about this briefly before, I actually think the fight scenes in Daredevil are incredibly realistic, because Matt Murdock gets the crap beat out of him, and he's breathing hard, and he's bleeding, and he's falling all over the place, and the fights are sloppy. And that feel like I get really excited when I see that, because I was like, oh, these people know what they're doing, because I recognize that feeling of being completely gassed and like wanting to fall over, but still having another minute left in this sparring round.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say for me, like I work in the movies, and like a lot of the computer graphics that I do, I'm constantly studying physics, like human anatomy. Like I have to know everything about it. So like, for example, when you move your jaw, it affects all the way up to your temple, and just like really subtle things that make the difference between, you know, a character that looks kind of realistic but creepy when they actually move versus something that's actually believable. And it's the same thing with just like, you know, huge machines, right? Like on Guardians of the Galaxy, there's that ship at the end that kind of turns, and I was in there doing every single piece, getting into the machinery. Or like, you know, in Alice in Wonderland, there's like the Jabberwocky and the Knights, just again exploring all that. So when I approached the mechas, I really wanted it to be realistic as possible for huge, gigantic robots. And so I got into, like, if you see the language that I use, a lot of it is sort of animation and physics based. So it talks about kinematics and just the joint placement. And I get a lot into also customization, because I feel like with mechas, if you had mecha drivers, everyone would want to have it specialized for who they are. So if you say a mecha has longer arms, they would actually have a longer reach, but they would be slower to move. So like, you know, the actual pilots would play with the different preferences that they have. So that gets back into my animation training, and again, just getting into it. So I, like, it's as realistic as CG is, but CG is fake. So it's true to CG, but I don't know how, you know, authentic that gets. So, yeah.
Well, I always like a heightened realism. Like, if you squint, it's probably going to work, because again, it is fiction, and I do want to have, you know, stakes and tension and things. But in this book specifically, there were just a lot of technical things I had to think about, because she's the only like uninfected person on this ship, and the air is not breathable. Any contact with the spores, so I had to be like, all right, at all times she has to be sealed in this suit. But then it's also a romance, so how do you create like sexy tension when there's a shield right here? So there was a lot to think about, but it was so great, because it was also like, oh, adds so much tension all the time. Like, even just breathing in the wrong place in this ship will be the end of it. So to me, it's like I had to think about that, and I had to think about, you know, the way that the parasite would interact with the people's body. I mean, and a lot of it's like, listen, this is an alien parasite I made up. You know, it's like, but I did do research, I did think about it. There is logic to it, but for me, it's like, what's in the best? I think this kind of goes with what everybody's saying, like, what is the best to service this particular story? So it changes every book, because some books are more fantastical, and I have, like, you know, in House of Furies, it's much more like fantasy based and a little more like elevated, and here it's more as realistic as I feel still services what the book has to do.
That leads into my next question really well, and it may be the same answer, but hopefully we can still get some good discussion out of it, because I think it's an important topic. I read an article recently about how basically calling out science fiction and fantasy authors for not having PTSD or similar things to that being an element in post-action parts of their stories, and whether that's a deliberate choice by authors or not, because either they don't understand it, or if it's just because it doesn't match like the tone or the level of fun they're going for, or whatever. But any thoughts on that in terms of, or maybe it is something you've tackled in your work?
It's actually like the point of, well, my Salvaged is, the hero character, she has recently experienced sexual assault, and so the whole book is actually her processing that and kind of learning to trust herself again and fall in love again and trust a man again. And it's very personal. I'm an assault survivor, so I drew on a lot of my own work in therapy and just life in general. So for me, it was like, I want to write a book about this. It's personal, but I also want to process it through a lens that I can kind of remove myself. You know, I don't want to write like a memoir or something like that. So for me, it's actually all about trauma and processing it, and how do you sort of, you know, find love and trust again after that's been totally shattered. So yeah, that is, I can totally understand that, but I can also see, like, you know, not everybody wants that in a book. It's like, right, you know, like sometimes you just want like something to kind of switch your brain off and have fun, and sometimes you want more of those complex feelings. So I think, again, it's like book to book for me, but this one in particular is very focused in that direction.
Yeah, I was going to say I remember I saw Skyfall it's Skyfall where Bond gets shot, and then he just kind of disappears for a while, but then he comes back like, oh, no problem. And that to me, like, I think it takes away from his humanity. Like, I like Skyfall, but like, I think when you have characters that go through traumatic events, like in here, they have in my book, there's a huge traumatic event where like the Nazis attack, and it's a disastrous defeat, and a lot of people die, and the main character is really depressed and just like, I don't even want to do this anymore. And you know, to not even acknowledge that, I think takes away from the humanity, because it kind of makes them alien or like robotic, where you're like, are these people even people? Like,
you can't identify with a character like that, because it just doesn't, I mean, unless that's like who they are, it's like that they project or something. But yeah, to me, it loses all stakes. Really.
Yeah, and the thing, I mean, for me personally, even when you kind of come to terms with like a past tragedy or trauma, it still stays with you. Like sometimes something will happen unconsciously and you'll be like, whoa, and then it'll just like shake you up. Or it'll be like a weird dream where you're like, oh my God, I thought I'd come to terms with it. And then I'll be like, I can't even sleep because I'm so disturbed by it. So I think drawing on sort of that dark side of who we are as writers is part of our, like, I don't want to say duty or responsibility, but at the same time, it's being true to the words. So I think that's a really important part to have and to incorporate. So.
Yeah, the private detective series that I wrote was a 5-book series, and so it was important to me that you saw this character's mental scars and how he was dealing with the decisions he made over the course of the series. But it was a 5-book series, so I had like years to do that. I wonder if sometimes it's hard to get that across when a book ends, when you're talking about something that really comes to bear in the months and years following. It's actually the book I'm working on right now is about a very disastrous event, and then it jumps to 6 years later, because I was slightly less interested in the, you know, let's deal with it now, and a little bit more interested in the how do we deal with this several years later when we've processed it and tried to fix it, and now we're kind of living in this new reality. Because that's, again, like that's where you find out what people are made of and how people react to things, and it's slightly more interesting to me right now than just the immediate aftermath.
Do you want people to come up to the microphone for questions? Yes? Okay. So if anybody has questions, we'll open it up to the audience now. So there's a microphone here in the middle. Just come on up and ask away.
Polite.
Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
You're good.
I guess the main question I had was like, how do you give, like, since we're talking sci-fi, like universe backstory, character backstory, without just info dumping a bunch of stuff on a reader?
It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, delicately.
Yeah, you have to fold it in. I actually have this technique where I write the beginning of my book like it's a piece of shit, and like I just let it, like I do it. I info dump, and I'm just like, once upon a time, and I like just lay it all out there, and then I cut. And then I start like where it actually starts. Like I think you don't find where a book starts until you kind of just blat, and then you find like, oh no, this is actually where the book starts. And then you just copy paste all that vomit and put it in another file, and you just find the places where it's relevant or where it would come up. You know, I have to explain a lot of tech, a lot of like sort of it's 200 years in the future, their version of essentially having an iPhone and the way that that plays out, and like, you know, AR emojis everywhere. It's incredibly annoying, you know, like, but you find ways to put that in, you know, like she has a coworker who's super irritating, always putting emojis on everything, and it's just like, oh my God, can you stop? But like, instead of saying, so in this future, we use this technology, you just have to, create the scenes in a way that, okay, it'll be easy and seamless for this to come up, and I can explain it in a sentence or two without having to just dump it on you. And I think that's partially, again, just finding out, okay, where does the story really start? How can I fold this in without boring you to tears, you know?
I was going to say it depends on the book too. Like for me, and with Mecha Empire, because they're cadets, I incorporated it into their training. So like when they're learning the history, they get into the lore of the mechas. So they start getting into like, oh, this battle, this happened, and you know, this kind of stuff. So I try to make it natural where there is an info dump, but it's part of, you know, their education. And another thing that I find really fascinating is a lot of times I'll put stuff as an Asian American author that I think, oh, this is very obvious, and then my editor or someone will read it and go, oh, what do you actually mean by this? And so that's an interesting area too, where it gets into information like how do you convey, like I might. Like one thing that I remember coming up in the political climate was just like, is bowing a form of weakness or a form of respect, right? For me, growing up as an Asian American, I would just bow to everyone. It wasn't like weakness, it was more just like a form of respect, right? So like, how do you show that in the context without being obvious and saying, oh, this is the Asian, whatever form of respect. So just again, working with my editor and just working with other readers to cultivate.
And that like context, right?
Yeah.
Like contextually, people are smarter than you think. Yeah. They'll pick up on stuff if you put it in the right context.
Yeah, no, I'm totally simpatico with you on that because I really like the show don't tell. Like just lead the characters through the scenario and through the day, and don't stop and say, well, this is because of this and this is because of this. You just let the like the reader will get there. Like readers are really savvy, so if you can just kind of show them the world, they'll kind of figure it out as it goes along.
And you really, like, it's the difference, to bring up video games again, it's the difference between a great tutorial and a crappy tutorial, where it's like, if you feel like Mega Man has the most incredible tutorials, right? Every level teaches you one thing. And then in the next level, you have to use that thing, but then the next thing that we're going to teach you. And that's a great tutorial. It's active. It's showing you. You have to figure it out instead of just, like, having a screen come up that says, press this to jump, press this to throw your thing, press this to shoot. Like, it's pulling you in with action and with context, not just by, like, screaming at you, essentially.
Can I ask another question before I go? Or
Why don't you swing back to the end of the line there, just so we give other people a chance too. Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
So I was just wondering, so given like, we're all sci-fi nerds here, can you tell me about what are the things to look out for when you start off with like an idea, and then when you like start just jotting down notes, how do you stick with it, So, yeah, for like you, Peter, with your mecha, if you, let's say, are a big enthusiast with robots, how do you make sure that it's something that you like to do, and then you're like, okay, so what do I do to make sure that I want to keep going with this when it comes to like writing out for like your books and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, like I think I began with the whole idea of the alternate history and like the family and like just the past background. Wanting to kind of share more about the Asian side of World War II. And so there was so much to say there. And then the robots became an expression of that. I think if I had just started off with, oh, I want to write about cool robots, it would have gotten to a certain point, but because I had the deeper theme that was kind of driving me, that's what made it more personal and more passionate. And that's, because you're always going to have lulls where, or at least for me, I have doubts all the time where I'm like, is this total shit? Like, what am I doing? Like, who's even going to want to read this?
Oh, no, I've never had that. That's like my mode of every day.
Yeah, so, and that's what keeps me going is like the deeper themes, right? So like, I think, for you, like, what are the things that really matter to you, right? Like, don't think about the surface, but like more personally, like what are the challenges you have and what are the things you struggle with, and make that something like broader and bigger using like the sci-fi elements, right? So, yeah.
I'm just going to give this as a general tip. Books are way more than you think it is. Like, you think, oh, wouldn't this be cool, like a premise? And then you're like, no, but you need like moment-to-moment beats. You need moment-to-moment things that happen. Like, I think most people, when they start to write a book, they underestimate how much stuff you need. Just like moment-to-moment business, action, things that people are doing, characters. It's just like, it's starting with a premise is great. And then having that deeper motivation is crucial. And then I think getting attached to at least one character that's going to start driving you into planning. Because otherwise, if you're just thinking like giant big thoughts, it's not happening on like a small level. And that's actually what people care about, is like the smaller moment-to-moment things.
Yeah, for me, it's like an obsession thing where I get shiny thing syndrome and I get like weird random ideas all the time.
Is it when you're about to have a deadline by chance? Okay.
Generally. Or when I'm far enough into a book that I should not turn back.
Yep.
And I'm like, oh, I should write another one. I create a new Google Doc every time I have an idea. Like, and some of them I look back on now. Like, I have one that says like time travel hotel, and I'm like, I don't even remember what that meant. But the reason I stuck with The Warehouse is because the book is very much about how big businesses corporations turn people into a disposable product, and they use us up and they throw us out. And I really latched onto some of the stories that I read about like Amazon retail workers who were being run into the ground, or chicken farmers who were forced to wear diapers because they weren't allowed to have bathroom breaks. And I just got really angry and really obsessed with it. And that's the thing that was like, okay, this is the book I need to be writing right now, because it's the one that I literally just can't stop thinking about.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
My question's for Madeleine Roux.
Oh, thanks.
You look strong as hell. I have to know the name of your personal trainer.
God, it's you.
I'm a personal trainer.
No, it's
Actually, my sister had a real
Demco
question.
Fitness.
Yes, Demco Fitness.
So I guess actually the guy before kind of addressed my question, but I'm struggling maybe even on a somewhat of a bigger scale, where I will get halfway through writing something and all of a sudden realize that either I've grown since I've started writing it and I don't even connect with the character or even the idea or anything behind it, and I just start all over. And so I feel like I've started 7 novels and never finished any of them because I just don't connect with it as I'm going.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, I feel like if you can find the one character that you're not going to get tired of, or maybe they do have to change. I mean, I'm a big fan of, like, I can't even count how many books I started before I actually finished a real one, and a lot of them that I did finish never saw the light of day, and it's never wasted. Like, that's not wasted work. You need to put in that. You need to kind of get all of that out of the way before you learn what it feels like to sit down and write a book. But I think we'd all agree, like, when you hit the sticky middle, there's always a moment where you're like, I can't. Like, I can't. Like, I give up. I'm gonna, you know what, this other idea is better. But, like, I think the difference is that you have to find your way through. You have to fight your way through and learn to end things, because endings are so important. And if you never get there, you're never going to learn how to end something. And that's why I always kind of recommend, like, start with short stories. If you can write like a 20-page short story that's satisfying, it has a beginning, middle, end, it really has an arc, and it has a good ending, then you've got the, like, on a small scale, you have the building blocks, right? And then you can sort of take what you've learned and apply it to, like, a novella, like go 70 pages or something. But I think if you never learn to end something, if you do get there in a novel, you're gonna be like, oh God, like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe you have to, and if I could just ask, like, do you generally know what your ending is going to be and where your characters are going to end up? Okay.
A lot of it I feel like might even just be age related, because I've been writing, I would say, since like high school up through now I'm in medical school, and just the way I see the world is so completely different from year to year right now that I think sometimes I get done, I'm like, wow, that's not even how life works. Like,
yeah. So. Because for me, I need to have a very clear image of the ending and just a feeling of excitement for getting the characters there. Like if and even that stuff in the middle, it can change or it can get moved around or it can shift. But I feel like if I have that one solid endpoint, like that one grace note to end on, it's like, okay, I can see my way through this no matter how confusing it gets in the middle part.
You don't have to write chronologically. Like, if there's a really great scene I know is coming, sometimes I'll skip ahead to do it, just to keep myself invested in the book, and then sometimes that actually opens up what was missing. You know what I mean? Because you realize, like, oh, I have to get this character to this place physically and emotionally. So how do then the steps become clearer. And I think your job as an author is just to ask yourself questions constantly and then answer them in the text. Like, why are they doing this right now? What do they want? How are they going to get it? And then those answers are the book, and it's also okay, like you're saying, like maybe you started it a long time ago and you just don't like feel like it's you anymore. It's okay to just scrap it. It's okay to say, okay, there's a seed of something here, but I might have to rework it. Like, that sucks, but it's really common. I've had to basically start over from scratch with books, and I'm on contract for them, But if it's just not working, it's not working, and you have to start over. But, like, always keep it, like, you can scrap it, but keep it. You never know what's buried in there,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So my question is more related around how do you do fight scenes? And the biggest thing around that is, how do you not get yourself so caught up in the technicality of the fight scene and but still get the emotion out? Because what I find for myself is I'll be writing a scene and then I'm like, what would have happened to his arm in this point? What would have happened to his foot at this point? And then I feel like I over-explain the fight scene. Is that something that I should be doing, or should I rein that back? I guess in general.
That's a tough one, because I feel like it's a mix of art and science. It's thinking of it you know, again, you want that realism, but you want it to flow, and you want it to move, and you want it to make sense on a page, and it's a hard thing to hit. I mean, I will sometimes overwrite fight scenes to a ridiculous degree, and then sit there and look at it, and I'm like, this 6 pages actually should be like 2 paragraphs, you know. I think that, you know, when all else fails, maybe cutting is the right answer, because I feel like overwriting is like the bane of every writer's existence. Or you could just act it out.
And ask a friend, maybe. Ask a friend if you're like, okay, when do your eyes start glazing over? You know, like, what point does this go too far? And because sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees in your own work. Like, I'm really, really bad at that. And luckily now I have great editors, so they help me with that. But like, when you're on your own, you got to find that friend that's great at like gently telling you the business. You know, it's just like, so at this point, when you described his foot for the 18th time, I kind of lost it. You know, like find someone who can like interpret your work back to you. Maybe that could be helpful.
Yeah, I was gonna also add, just like for me, like every fight is an expression of the characters and the personalities, and so like for me, like a film that I like to watch a lot is Birdman, just because every scene there's like a dynamic, right? And like in every scene you go in with certain assumptions, and then the assumptions get flipped. So you might be like, why is this coming up for a fight scene? That's the way I approach fight scenes. It's a dialogue between these characters. They're just using their fist or, you know, machine guns or weapons, but it's really about what these characters represent and what they're aiming for. And so for me, like every moment that they have, every action, every like defensive move is really about their personalities, and everyone is distinctive, right? So that to me is like, for me, when it gets to a point where it's not about the characters anymore, it's just fighting, then I just go, okay, it's done. Then I actually almost summarize it where I go, they're just fighting for like another 10 minutes, but like, you know, you got the point, right? So not in those ways, but yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, so I guess my second question is kind of, how do you figure out, like for, I guess, book to book or just in general, how realistic to make your science fiction? Like how much do you stick to actual science as opposed to soft science?
So I always pick a person in mind that I'm writing a book for, or a type of customer, because I think that will actually answer a lot of questions when you're writing a book, because I know that the books I write are not for people who are going to sit there and be like, well, I don't know if the engine would work exactly that way. Like, that's not really my audience. It's just not. Like, this is an adventure. It's a romantic adventure. You're there for the tension and the excitement and the romance and the horror. Like, that's what this book is for. And so I think if you're like, okay, well, but I know I'm writing for a more technical audience. Like, I want my customer to be someone who's really interested in the intricate details. Like, then you'll know how far you need to push it. I think if you don't have an audience in mind, it won't be consistent. You know what I mean? You'll run into places where you over-explain, and then you'll sort of skip it in another place. But for me, when I know clearly who I'm writing for, it kind of answers itself. And I can put in just enough detail where it's like, I've thought about this. This is kind of how it would work. But you're not here for me to explain how every part of the ship works to you, you know? Whereas, like, if you're reading a mech book, you might have someone in mind who's like, no, they really understand physics and robotics, and so you're going to have to go into more detail like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just adding to that, I think it just depends on, like, the story you're writing and what you're passionate about, right? Because, like, I can tell you write a super technical book about X and X, but that might not be what you're passionate about as a writer, right? So that's something I think you got to ask yourself, like, do you want to do that? Like, I try to get super technical with the mechas, but at the same time, I got notes like, this is getting too technical. So I was like, okay, I'll draw that back. Like, I had literally pages and pages of documentation about like all this stuff, and they were like, you geeked out too much. So
and people will know if you're a fraud. Yeah. Like, if you, like, I know I don't have a mind for science. So I'm like, okay, I have to put this in terms that make me sound like an authority. So I have to do the research and interview people. But at a certain point, I just know it's not going to sound like I know what I'm talking about. So that's kind of where I bump up to. At what point does it stop sounding natural, you know, for this book? And then for me, that's when I feel like, okay, I'm over-explaining and I'm not even explaining it correctly. So, like, not important, you know? Like, my characters are important, my story is important. Are people really going to put down the book if I screw something up with, like, this engine component? I mean, if they do, then it wasn't for them, you know? So.
Yeah, I think the story kind of dictates, you know, like everything. I wanted everything in the warehouse to feel very realistic, and even though it's like this big, like massive live-work facility that's kind of like based on Foxconn in Asia, I still wanted all the technology and all the processes to feel like, okay, yeah, like this is maybe not today, but this could be in like, you know, a year or two. But that was very specifically to put people in the shoes of people who are living in like this really terrible work environment. Whereas again, like if you're dealing with mechs, like all of a sudden you're dealing with a much bigger fantastical kind of element that's going to just have completely different demands.
One small note, by realism, you have to do more, like, sorry, this is obvious, but you have to do more than Wikipedia, because that's not enough. Like, you really need to go out there and research, like, books and go out and meet people and talk to people, because, like, people will know, oh, they just got it off Wiki, right, and stuff like that, so, yeah.
And also, like, look at N.K. Jemisin's stuff on world building. It's really brilliant, and will help you sort of know where to start and also know where to end, I think.
Thank you.
Hello, this is like an extension to the previous question. Like when I think of combat in the future, like, and the way like technology is heading, I think that it'll be over like really fast, and it'll be done using like automated drones or something, but that doesn't make for like an interesting action sequence. So I'm kind of curious, like, you know, action in the far future, the, you know, future technology, like how do you use it so that it like adds to an action sequence and doesn't like detract from it?
Well, one of the worst inventions for authors was this, because if you're running from the serial killer, you just call 911 because you have this on you all the time now. You always have GPS. You always can be found. So for me, it's like one of the first questions I answer in my future sci-fi and in my YA series, which is just like our tech, is like, how do I get the technology away from them? How do I, you know, it's sci-fi, but like in mine, I made the circumstances specifically so that they couldn't use things like that. So that like everything goes down, essentially. The ship is almost non-functional, like they have life support, but not a lot else. So for me, that's how I did it personally, because I didn't want to have to use high-tech weaponry or anything when they're fighting. So for me, it was just on a very like visceral, you have your hands and your body and everything else, because I specifically baked it into the premise that they will not have access to that type of stuff. Because for me, it kind of, you're right, it takes away, it's fast, it's going to be brutal, fast, violent, and over, but like I didn't want that. So for me, that's part of it, is like if you don't want to deal with that, you either need to world build in a way that they don't have that technology, or find a way to get it out of their hands in a, you know, in a plausible way.
And you can also, I mean, if you have the answer to that, you'd have a bestseller, right? Because it'd be like, you know, but work with that. Like, why does it not have to, you know, even if it's fast, why not build some tension into it, right? That's part of your, oh, sorry. Hello? Oh, yeah. That's, you know, as a writer, you have to take an assumption and then throw it on its back. And like say, why does it have to be boring? Why does it have to be, you know, it can be instantaneous, right? But, you know, if you have tons of buildup, like you were saying, the context, right? So you find out everything that's going on behind the scenes, the politics, the people behind it, the scientists, and then it might be over in 1 second, but, you know, for the people who are, you know, the readers, it might be like the most fascinating second of their lives, right? So if you can have that, I mean, it'd be amazing, right? I'd read it, so, you know.
Yeah, I think it's your job as a writer to kind of find that story around it. And, you know, there was some criticism about why Nick Fury didn't page Captain Marvel during the first Avengers movie, and it's like, well, then there wouldn't have been a movie, you know. You kind of have to work within the framework to build out what you have, and you know, yeah, you know, maybe warfare changes or becomes more different, but you know that can hamstring you, you know, like there's got to be more to it than that.
I was gonna say,
Thank you.
Ghost Fleet by August Cole. And P.W. Singer, that has drones, it's futuristic warfare, very good, and it gets into like all the different factions and stuff like that, so that's one I'd recommend checking out if you're interested in future
Thank
warfare.
you.
Thanks.
I was just wondering, between everything else in your lives, how do you find time to write?
It's my only job, so I pretty much feel guilty if I'm not doing it. I don't know. I actually don't schedule myself. A lot of authors do. It's probably smarter. I tend to work well under pressure, so I give myself a lot of deadlines. And I actually wrote more, I feel, when I had a job. Like, I was so desperate to do something other than what I was doing that I would just get home and that's all I would do. And I would like I had a boyfriend, I'd be like, shut up! Like, I just have to like do this. So I feel like I almost produced more when I had other stuff to do. But yeah, I mean, like everyone has said, if you don't have a story idea that like you wake up excited to get back to work on, you're never going to find the time to write. It's not that you don't want to write or that you don't have the time. It's that you haven't found the thing that like gets you excited, and that more than anything is going to put you at the desk, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm at the point where if I don't write for a while, I feel weird. Like I'm just like, it starts affecting me physically and mentally, right? Where
And
I'm
it's
like,
a muscle. Like you have to practice.
Yep.
So.
And but for me, I work and I write, and I just try to have a word count that I try to hit every day. So that could be in the morning, that could be in the night, and then like I don't hit it all the time, but if you even do 500 words a day, that's actually like a whole novel in a year, right? And if you had to write a novel every year, that's that's pretty. At least for me, that's pretty good. So that's kind of what I try to do. So.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to find time because I have a daughter, and I've now started working part-time, but it's a slog. I mean, I used to be a journalist, so I'm used to working quickly and working on deadlines. So I will actually make people give me deadlines. I'll have them make them up. I'll tell my agent, like, just tell me when you want the book. Tell me when to give it to you, and I will have it done. I just need a date. But I mean, at the end of the day, the work gets done or it doesn't, and the difference between a published writer and an unpublished writer is whether the work got done. So sometimes it means sacrifice. I used to be a really big baseball fan and then finally realized, like, I cannot watch 100 games a year because that's 3 or 4 hours a night that is completely shot to shit that I could have more effectively used. Every time everyone's talking about, like, the new hot show on Netflix they just binged, I'm like, cool, I will see it in 6 months. When I'm done with the thing I'm working on. So, sometimes it's really just a matter of putting things aside.
I totally agree. I actually think that is mostly the difference between people who get published and don't, are just can you physically produce a novel? I feel like most of the time when I have friends who have actually finished a novel and I look at it, I'm like, oh, that we can make this work. Like, this could be publishable. But most of the time when people tell me they're a writer, I'm like, oh, how many books have you finished? And it's 0. So if you can just actually do the work, there's a very high percentage that you can be successful. It's that most people never even get to the end. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I write superhero fiction, and I end up with these action scenes at the end that are ridiculously complex with like 22 superpowered people in 17 locations. And what are some of the planning and organizing tools that you've found that help you kind of manage all of that?
Well, my casts tend to be pretty small in my books, specifically to avoid things like that, because I personally don't enjoy writing a book where I have to keep track of that much stuff, and I just feel like I can better make the characters more invested in if they're smaller. For me, that's just my personal style. I also think you can do a lot with how you structure the point of view. If you have multiple POVs, then you could split those action scenes up between chapters so that in one sequence we're seeing it through the villain's eyes, and in the next chapter it's through someone else. I think if you had like a first-person narrative with that, it would be okay, yeah. But for example, it would be very troublesome. So I think my approach would be to split it between locations and point of views for clarity. But I think too, like, again, what we've always said is like it's down to the character and what do they actually want, what are they actually trying to get, and why. And I think if you keep that in mind, you can probably scale it down a little bit so that it's still fun and exciting, but isn't just action for action's sake. And for me, like, I think you said you acted out, but I usually just like draw big diagrams to choreograph things. That's just like for me, that's the easiest way to do it, to visualize it. I don't really have any more sophisticated techniques than that. So.
Yeah, like I think each book, each battle, I do it differently. But for Mecha, because it took place in Berkeley and San Francisco, I actually just went to the places, took photos, and kind of did like a little Photoshop chart just to get an idea of where everything is, and just like kind of put it together and then outlined it. For the third book, there's another book that's coming out. There's a huge battle, and I actually when I was outlining that, I based it around Moby Dick, where like they meet the 9 different ships before they meet Moby Dick. So I kind of followed that outline. So they'd meet 9 different mechas. So I had that as sort of a framework. So that's kind of the way I approach it. So I try to, every book is different, every battle's different. So again, like what you're describing sounds very complex. So, you'd have to find your own unique way of approaching it. But yeah, just whatever works just to get you through it, right? So it's like a battle, right? Just fight.
Yeah, I've never done any like really big, complicated stuff with like a lot of characters. I am constantly in awe of what the Russo brothers did with Civil War and Infinity War, because they have these massive sequences of all these characters fighting, and they feel like they have geography, and everyone gets a moment, and things will start going really bad for someone, and then all of a sudden there's a bigger moment where someone steps up. So they have this incredible ability to sort of cut between, they take the big giant fight and they break it down into smaller sequences that kind of play off each other and then intersect and break apart again. I feel like if I was ever going to write a gigantic fight scene, I would just rewatch those 2 movies like 8 times in a row. As if I don't do that all the time anyway.
Yeah. I think too, but you bring up a good point, is that they specifically also match people, the people who go against each other make sense, right? Because they're either like opposites, or they have like they have a reason to have funny banter. So that might actually direct you as well, as like, who are the most interesting, most logical people to be facing off against each other? Like, who's gonna have the biggest spark or the most like the funniest banter? Like that might be a good way to sort of narrow down like moment to moment what you're focusing on.
Okay, thank you.
What is your guys' favorite science fiction book of all time, or what did you get your most inspiration out of curiosity?
Favorite science fiction book?
Fahrenheit 451. Full stop.
I have to pick. It's not fair.
There's so many.
I'm a huge fan of Lois McMaster Bujold's Miles. I mean, it's not even it's a bazillion books, but it's super good. She's incredible. One of the most I can't believe she doesn't make more lists about sci-fi. It blows my mind. I'm also a huge Jeff Vandermeer fan. Anything he writes, including Wonder Book, which if you are an aspiring novelist, please buy it. It is one of the best craft books. It is fully illustrated, these pictures of his beautiful, weird mind, but you will learn so much about writing from that. But yeah, that's just my plug for someone else.
I'm a big fan of Philip K. Dick's works. So like Do Androids Dream, Man in the High Castle, and stuff. But yeah, it's very hard to pick one science fiction book, and there's science fiction games that are great too, like Metal Gear, Son of the Enders. I'm just a big Hideo Kojima fan.
Mass Effect.
Yeah, Mass Effect, and just so much, right? So it's yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question, which is perfect.
Hopefully it won't be a long question. So earlier you were talking about it's okay to not write chronologically, and when I'm writing, I find that's almost a problem, because I'll write 80 pages, but it's basically a montage of oh, this really cool action sequence I have in mind, or this really cool character beat moment, but then I can't figure out how to connect it. So how do you work on that? Is that something you've experienced before, where you feel like you have your favorite moments and you're like, how do I get from point A to point B?
That's kind of how I outline, actually. I'll usually do a big corkboard, and I'll have Post-its. And so, for example, you could break down every one of those big scenes, and you write it, just a general, 3-word synopsis on a Post-it, and you put it generally where you think it's going to go. And then I start to fill in the gaps, and then I transfer that to a Word document so I can do it more moment to moment. But for me, it's great to have those, okay, the beginning has a big splashy thing, there's this thing in the kind of quarter, in the middle, and then the end. And for me, it's those are great, and then there's your job again to start asking questions. Okay, but why does that big moment happen in the middle? What happens to get there? And that's actually where more of the magic in the book happens. That's more of the character development, the dialogue. And so for me, it's it's great to have those big key moments in your mind when you're planning, but for me, they're just sort of that's almost the reward of doing the more work of the book, which is the nitty-gritty of like, who is this person? Why do we care about them? What are they trying to get? And I think if you can really focus in on character, it'll start to answer a lot of those questions. Like if you fill in their backstory, the how they get there, the why they get there, what they're trying to achieve, will hopefully start to color in. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's okay to have it in a montage and then in an outline or with a, whatever, however you want to do it. Then it is your job, though, to go back in and start finding the connective tissue.
I have days I call bridge days, where I have like scenes, and then I have to fill in between. I hate those days, but I have those days saved for me just to connect them. So I have specific days for that when I'm done with all the fun scenes that I wanted to write. So.
I do this thing when I outline, so I always know sort of like the big beats and the big moments, and sometimes it's the little fiddly things in the middle that are hard. So what I'll do is I'll outline everything, and then I throw it out. And then a couple of days later, I outline from memory, and then probably throw that one out too. And I'll do that 4 or 5 or 6 times. And the reason is you always remember the good stuff, and you always forget the crappy stuff. And you give yourself time to just kind of like turn it over in your head. And I find that's usually when I figure out all the little fiddly things, because as I'm just kind of stewing over it, it's like, oh, wait, yeah, this makes sense. Okay, cool. So I'm a big fan of just forgetting stuff and just trashing things.
Yeah, like if you have an idea that sticks with you for years and years and years, it'll probably change over time, right? It's going to evolve. But the big important stuff is going to stay, and you're going to remember it, and it's going to develop and develop. And one of the tricks I use is, especially when I'm kind of in a sticky part or a fiddly part, if I'm bored writing it, you're bored reading it. So I'm like, okay, time to like kill someone, or like a monster's crashing through the door. Like something has to, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, that is to me one of like the things I always have in mind when I'm writing. I'm like, am I enjoying this? And like, if I read this back, is it exciting? Is it engaging? If I'm bored by it, 100% somebody else is. So for me, it's like having that, fine-tuning that sort of radar when you're writing and being like, okay, like what can I have happen that's logical and makes sense, but like how can I inject a little oomph into this sequence so it's not just someone like thinking sad thoughts, staring at a wall. Like there has to be more business and more action, and a lot of times those little businesses lead to breakthroughs, even if it's just like, oh, I have to fix this thing or I have to research this thing, it'll lead to breakthroughs for the character.
So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're out of time. Real quick, everyone's going to be over in the autograph section, I think in a half an hour. Or is it immediately? Okay, sometimes they put a little break in between. But anyway, we'll be over in the autograph area. Real quick, next release and when it's coming out.
Sure. The last book in House of Furies trilogy is coming out in May. It's called Tomb of Ancients, and my sci-fi debut comes out in October 15th. It's called Salvaged.
The next book in the USJ series will come out in March of next year, and I just want to say also for the signing, I have this special art from Japan. Like
I have magnets.
Yeah. Like, a really cool designer. He designed a bunch of these, so I have these for free. So if you just come by, you don't even have to buy a book. I have a bunch of them, so yeah.
These are really cool. Really, really cool. She's on the back too.
The Warehouse comes out on August 20th. It has been optioned for film by Ron Howard, so get a copy now. We're giving away galleys, so you don't even have to pay for it. And I have a cool stamp, and I will give you a job assignment at Cloud if you would like.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.